Hi students, we're looking at part 2 of our unit on institutions that are important for prosperity. So let's jump right in. Now in part 2 we're going to move on to discuss the institutions, reminding you that institutions refers to established arrangements and structures that are part of the culture or society. And as we said in Unit 1, that determines what life is like for citizens of a country. We've already noted that there are 3 categories. We're going to be talking about political institutions, economic institutions, and legal institutions. One quick note, some of you might be watching this for another class and you might be wondering, what is all this stuff about Thailand and Asia? Well, just know that this was created for my Thailand study abroad program, but we have to use somebody as examples, so why not Thailand? All right, let's go. Category number 1, we're talking about political institutions, and you probably actually understand this pretty well. Of course, government is one of the most important institutions that we have. Government needs to set the right incentives that generate efficiency, right? Its role shouldn't be too big. I know you learned that in your political science classes. And we need regulation, and government has a big hand in that, but we don't want too much regulation. So we don't want government to have too much of a heavy hand. And we also need government to monitor markets, but we don't want them to monitor markets too much, right? We don't want government interfering with the market process. Remember, we're in an economics class and economists like free markets. So we would never be in favor of a lot of government interference in the market process. Government defines our political freedoms. Let's think about communism, and I know you understand this. Let's think about how it contrasts with what you know about democracy. Of course, the incentive structure was very different and political freedoms were very different. So let's think about behind the Iron Curtain, those countries that were communist. Government controlled most aspects of people's lives. There weren't a lot of checks and balances, right? We had a large, powerful central government that controlled the media and information. There wasn't transparency. Most of the cases probably involved mandatory voting, but there was only one party, so you didn't really have a choice. It was illegal to criticize the government. You didn't enjoy freedom of speech or the right to assemble, and you didn't have freedom to travel. However, in democracy, we're talking about rule by the people, government by the majority. So hopefully fair and honest government with transparent decision making. You have the right to vote or not vote. You could run for office. You can criticize the government because you have the right to free speech in that way and the right to assemble. And again, we're just keeping it very simple. Economists use the index of democracy, which is a score that measures the degree of democracy in a country. And this is going to be evaluated based on things like the electoral process and pluralism. Again, pluralism is people of different beliefs and backgrounds. Can they coexist? Civil liberties, individual rights protected by law, by unjust government interference. So what does the electoral process look like? Is there pluralism? What do civil liberties look like, and are they protected? The functioning of government, how well does it do? Political participation, political culture. Again, we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty, but you understand from other classes you've had the general idea of what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, we have some headlines that suggest that global democracy is falling. Here's from The Economist, and this is a good source, one that economics professors would definitely rely on. They're saying a new low for global democracy, and that's 2022. Freedom House, democracy in retreat. And I could give you a whole bunch of other headlines like this. I'm not going to, but you get the idea that there's concern that across the globe we've been seeing democracy shrinking instead of expanding. Here's the 2022 Democracy Index results. Let's look at the first column, which suggests we can divide the world's countries into full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, and then authoritarian regimes. Let's look at the far right column, and this is the percent of the world population that lives in these different types of situations. We have 8% of the world's population living in a full democracy, 37% in a flawed democracy, Almost 18% of the world's population lives in a hybrid regime. And look, 36.9% of the population, almost 37% of the population, lives under an authoritarian regime, right? So if democracy is shrinking over time, this is certainly going to be problematic. Where does Thailand fit into this? Well, it's one of the countries that is considered to be a flawed democracy. It's also in good company because the United States is also considered to be a flawed democracy. An interesting thing is that if we look at the best performers, we see that Thailand made the list of the 10 upgrades. Look at Thailand. They've actually gone up in score between 2021 and 2022. So that's good. For at least Thailand, they're not seeing that same kind of retreat in democracy that we might be seeing in other places. So the left side shows those countries that are getting better, becoming more democratic, but on the right side, we see ones that are becoming less democratic, that between 21 and 22, they actually took steps back. Here's another index that looks at a 10-year decline, and this is Freedom House's Freedom Index. It covers a lot of different things, some of which are these democratic types of measures. Look at Thailand. Unfortunately, they're on the list here of countries that made the largest 10-year decline list. Okay, so that's not very good. And it rates Thailand as being only partially free. Of course, it goes across different measures. But again, this is suggesting that Thailand is not a full democracy, right? If we look at Freedom in the World Index 2023, we see that the same index from Freedom House, we have countries with wide ranges of degrees of freedom. If we look at those that are blue, the darkest blue is the most free, going all the way down to the orange and the brown. So we see that if we look at countries across the globe, not everyone enjoys a lot of freedom. Now, where does Thailand fit into this? They have a rating of 30. Yikes. Okay, that's not great. That puts them, on the less free half of the spectrum. But it depends on the company you keep whether this looks good or not, because here's Myanmar and they get a 9. So Myanmar is clearly much less free than Thailand is. Now, stability of government is important, and this theme has come up in other contexts. When you have stability in government, it creates certainty, and certainty guides decisions. For example, would you invest in education if it's highly uncertain that you can do anything with it? Would you invest in education if there's some chance that, like what happened in Burma, they will shut down your university? Well, certainty is important when you're making investments. Would you open a business in an environment that's highly unstable? No, you probably wouldn't. And if you're a foreigner, do you engage in foreign direct investment with a country that doesn't have certainty, that doesn't show stability? Well, no, you're not going to. So stability is really important. It drives a lot of decisions, especially economic decisions. And stability has been a concern for Thailand, as we've probably discussed already. Of course, stability is a bigger concern in other parts of the globe. I'm not trying to suggest that Thailand is a super unstable place. There are countries that have civil unrest, and that clearly would be politically unstable. We have military dictatorships. For example, would Myanmar be a good place to invest right now, given what's going on with the civil unrest in the country and a military dictatorship? Probably not. So is foreign direct investment going to flow into Myanmar right now? Probably not. Political stability is clearly tied to growth. It is absolutely crucial. Let's talk about corruption, because that's another important political element. Freedom from corruption is important. We want transparent and honest government that is corruption free. That makes absolute sense. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Why do we care about corruption though? Corruption bleeds off resources. When you have corruption, it diverts resources to activities that are not efficient. In Guatemala, for example, corruption is just a part of government. People are used to it. They know that leaders are going to embezzle money. It is just expected. That is diverting resources from efficient uses. Because Guatemala has so much problem with corruption, schools don't get the resources that they need. They don't get books. They don't get money. I have visited schools in Guatemala that are in shambles. And why? Because the resources aren't there. They've been bled away from corruption. So when you have corruption, it means resources are not used in the optimal manner. And that's clearly not a good thing. If we look at this graphic, we see something very interesting. Now see what's on the two axes when you're reading a graph. It's always important to do that. On the horizontal axis, we have measures of corruption from the Transparency International Corruption Index, another interesting index. Now this dates back to 2010 and I could not find an updated version, but I promise you the result would be the same. On the vertical axis, we have the 2010 per capita GDP. So we're looking at the relationship between corruption and gross domestic product per capita, which is a proxy for average income, right? Well, what do we see here? Let's look at those countries that are the most corrupt. Corrupt is on the left, so the spectrum kind of works a little backwards. On the horizontal axis, we're going from most corrupt to least corrupt. So those countries that are most corrupt are going to be to the left. What do we see in that purple circle? Those countries that are most corrupt also have the lowest per capita gross domestic product. So more corruption correlates with lower income. That's not surprising. Again, corruption bleeds away resources from activities that would be highly productive, and it diverts them to activities that are not productive. So let's quickly recap. Hopefully, you understand political institutions matter. Countries thrive when governments are transparent and honest, and countries that suffer from corruption, well, they're going to fail to thrive for obvious reasons. Governments must be stable, as we've talked about. If you want to attract foreign direct investment, well, that's important for prosperity, then stability is going to matter. All right, let's move on to our category number 2, economic institutions. The type of economic system we live in also matters. An economic system is going to determine the incentive structure in which people live. So let's think about living under a certain set of incentives that are created by our economic system. Well, we're living under capitalism, and capitalism has clearly run out globally as being the best economic system, right? Capitalism sets the right incentives. We have competition, and competition is good. Competition increases quality. It lowers prices. It stimulates innovation. We've seen a lack of success of these planned economies, like behind the Iron Curtain, right? Those economies associated with communism. They weren't successful. They failed to be efficient. And now what do we see? We have Eastern Europe, which has reformed to capitalism, right? We saw the fall of communism and the associated economic system of central planning, and now Eastern Europe is mainly capitalistic. The economic system that you live in defines economic freedoms. So the economic system is going to define the kind of economic freedoms that are enjoyed by its citizens. Now, economic freedoms are different from political freedoms. You understand political freedoms. Political freedoms are the right to vote, to run for office, to criticize the government, get information, just keeping it simple. Economic freedoms are something very different. Economic freedoms are your ability to make economic decisions that are in your best interest. So political freedoms, right to vote, run for office, criticize government, get information, but economic freedoms are about your decision making and your ability to make decisions for yourself. For example, how much education to get? Well, do you pursue a university diploma or not? That's your economic freedom. What career to start? That's your economic freedom. Where to live? What kind of housing? Do you want to buy a house? Do you want to rent an apartment? You get to choose, and you get to choose which one and where. Those are economic freedoms. Do you want to invest money? And if so, where do you want to invest your money? Again, these are all economic freedoms. Let's compare and contrast then what life would be like in terms of the way you would be living under what we called central planning, the economic system that went with communism, versus if you were living in a democratic country in an economic system of capitalism. Well, communism and central planning as an economic system, government makes almost all economic decisions, and you as a private citizen would have little to no economic freedoms. Remember, if you lived in a communist country under centrally planned types of economies, you would be an employee of the government, and all factories would be government owned. There wouldn't be any private enterprise because it was illegal to be an entrepreneur. Your salary would be set by the government, not by the marketplace. So everyone would get the same type of salary for the same kind of job, and there'd be no merit raises. Why work hard when there's no merit raises? Everybody gets the same thing for the same job. You'd have no choice in where to live. Apartments would have been assigned to you. Government decided what to produce, and they didn't believe in there being a lot of consumer choice. So maybe one kind of toothpaste, one kind of shampoo. You get the idea. That would be the economic institutions that you would live under, and clearly they would dictate the type of incentives that you operated in. Whereas if we were talking about capitalism as an economic system, well, here we've got resources allocated by the market, and economic activity is decided upon by individuals. You and I have lots of economic freedoms. Businesses have a competition motive, right? They want to compete, they have a profit motive, but also you can benefit from your efforts, right? If you want to work hard and go to college, you get to reap the benefits of that. You can own a business, you can be an entrepreneur, you can go to college, or you can not go to college and go into a trade. It's your choice because you get to choose your occupation. You get choice about how to spend your money, and we know under capitalism we see lots of consumer choice. The Heritage Foundation has created an index of economic freedom, and that allows us to compare between countries. It also allows us to compare over time to see if economic freedoms are increasing or decreasing. By the way, Singapore rates as number one on the Heritage Foundation's index. So that's interesting because we know Singapore is the richest country in Southeast Asia, but it's also the most economically freest country in the world. United States is number 25, not a bad place to be. We're in good company, but a lot of people might have suspected we would be higher, and we're not. This is a heat map from this index of economic freedom, and first please take a look at the bottom left corner because these colors tie into whether a country is free, dark green, whether a country is mostly free, and again we're talking about economic freedom, that's that lighter green, then that light orange, moderately free, dark orange, mostly unfree, and then red, repressed. Unfortunately, even into 2023, we're seeing we still have a lot of repressed countries. We have a lot of countries that do not have economic freedom. And then there's also in that darker orange a lot of countries that are mostly unfree. So the degree of economic freedom that people have, it really varies from country to country. Now, I'm circling Southeast Asia here, and you see within Southeast Asia, we've got one red country, right? Burma, Myanmar, And then you see 2 in that darker orange. We see Laos and we see Cambodia. Having a blank there for a moment. So we've got repressed and mostly unfree countries in Southeast Asia. But what's interesting and what you can't really see is if you were to look, go all the way down Thailand, down to Malaysia, and the very tip of Malaysia, right where Singapore is, there's a little bitty green dot, because remember, Singapore is the #1 most economically free country. It's just so teeny tiny you can't really see it on the map. Let's take a further look at Thailand, because this index allows you to get all of the numbers that go into determining the level of economic freedom. So on the left, you see that Thailand has an economic freedom score of 59.4. And all of these things go into it: property rights, judicial effectiveness, government integrity. Oh, so look at the 4th circle over. Government integrity gets a pretty low rating, right? And we know that there's been a lot of issues with government and some programs for rice subsidies, and there's been some potential corruption, right? If you go back 1 circle, judicial effectiveness gets a low rating. Other things get a pretty decent rating, but there clearly are some things that are holding Thailand back from having a higher rating in this index. With a score of 59.4, that makes Thailand the 80th economically freest country in the world. Okay, again, that's not horrible, but 80 is not that high either, right? What is of concern is that we're seeing a decline here. That if we look at Thailand's economic freedom index score over time, it was going up, 67, 68, 69, going up. Ooh, now we're going down. So economic freedom seems to be in retreat a bit in Thailand. Again, the company you keep sometimes makes you look a little better, right? So what I've done is pulled Thailand's scores and Burma's scores and look at this time period. This is going way back, 1995 to 2023. So I've captured a very large window, lots of data. And in between the two, in yellow, is the world average. Well, what can we conclude from this? Well, a couple things. One, Thailand fares much better than Burma, Myanmar, I should be saying. Thailand fares much better than Burma or Myanmar. And Thailand is above the world average. Okay, that's not so bad. And clearly in relationship to Burma or Myanmar, Thailand looks really good. What I've done here is I've added as many of the Southeast Asian countries that I can. It won't let me put them all together. That's too much data. But look what we see. Singapore way at the top. Again, that's not surprising because they're #1 in the world in this economic freedom index. But then the others are fairly tightly grouped, right? But Thailand is higher than Cambodia and Indonesia and Laos. So Thailand, again, does look good relative to these Southeastern Asian nations. Here I've added Vietnam in the dark orange. We've got Laos in that light orange, and then Philippines is in blue. I couldn't get all of these on, so Vietnam and Philippines are the ones that I've added for the first time. And Philippines looks better than the others. It's the closest to Thailand, but Thailand is still better than all of them. So basically, it looks like if we were trying to make a generalization, if we ignore Singapore, which is a very wealthy country and clearly an outlier for Southeast Asia, Thailand is doing the best. So I guess that makes Thailand kind of #2 in Southeast Asia, but keep in mind Southeast Asia as a whole doesn't enjoy the kind of economic freedoms we see in, for example, the United States. Here's something interesting but not necessarily surprising. This study right here grouped countries by free, mostly free, moderately free, mostly unfree, and repressed, and then looked at GDP per capita. Well, not surprising. Look at the very first column on the left. Those countries that are free have the highest GDP per capita. And if we go to the right, those that are mostly unfree or repressed have the lowest. So, not surprising. Economically free countries have higher incomes. This is 2015 data, but again, we could pull the most recent data and we're going to still find the same result. Further evidence of the importance of our economic systems comes from a naturally existing experiment in Asia, and that's North versus South Korea. Now, it's important to understand that before World War II, Korea was unified. So these weren't two different countries back then. That means they shared the same people and they shared the same culture. They had similar levels of physical capital. They had access to the same technology. But after World War II, this country divided. I know you already know that North Korea was controlled by the USSR and it became a communist state, and it had a centrally planned economy. So it's not capitalism. It's one of those planned economies where government has a heavy hand and controls really all productive activities. South Korea, on the other hand, was controlled by the United States, and it was democratic, and it adopted a capitalist free market model like we have here in the United States. 50 years later, this is what we see from outer space when we look down at North and South Korea. We see North Korea at night almost pitch black, whereas South Korea is vibrant. Well, the explanation is that North Korea cannot generate enough power for lights at night. It doesn't have the resources. We know North Korea doesn't have a thriving private sector. Everything is collectivized and controlled by the government. And if we look at the Economic Freedom Index, North Korea is the most unfree place in the world. So it's not surprising. If we look at the health of North Koreans versus South Koreans, a 13-year-old boy, and again, remember, these are from the same people culturally and ethnically, right? North Koreans are much smaller than South Koreans. This isn't surprising. South Koreans are thriving. They live in a capitalistic economic system. North Koreans, on the other hand, deal with great amounts of scarcity. So let's recap. We've said that economic institutions matter. They determine our economic freedoms, but unfortunately, we see a lot of nations that are not economically free. Remember that heat map that we just took a look at. And this affects well-being, right? The best evidence comes from the naturally occurring experiment that we just took a look at, North and South Korea. And again, we kept it simple, but you can do lots of research, and all signs point to that one has thrived, the other has not. Let's finish this by talking about legal institutions, our third category. And we're going to keep this relatively brief. We're not lawyers, but it is important to understand the basics. Having a good legal system is also important for growth. It facilitates contracts. It makes it easier to do business. And that should make sense, right? Think about it. When there's a good legal system, things are more predictable. You want to do business with somebody, you basically understand how things are going to work. Both parties understand the rules of the game. So I can negotiate with you and you with me with this common understanding because things are well defined in our legal system. It also protects property from others, including government. The fact that we have a legal system means that if you violate my land, you build a fence on my land, I have some way to handle the dispute. I can keep people off my land. In some countries, the legal system is not well established. No one knows who owns what because there might be limited systems of registrations. And I found an example from India. India has actually suffered from this problem. In some areas of India, residents who purchase land must do so more than once. Well, why? Why would you be purchasing the same land more than once? Well, because there was a lack of proper record keeping. And if there's a lack of proper record keeping, then their original purchase couldn't be proven. If you can't prove that the land is yours, then you have to rebuy it all over again, if you can imagine such a thing. In some countries, our property rights are insecure. Now, here in the United States, our property rights are pretty secure. I own my house and my land. I can prove that I own my house and land. There are good systems of registration. But in a place like Burma or Myanmar, there are no real property rights for land. And if you're in Myanmar, you can buy the land, but it can be seized by government at any time. And if they seize your land, they're not going to compensate you. So there's no compensation involved when this happens. And if your land is forested, the seizure is more likely. Why would the government want forested land? Why are they more likely to take your land from you? And again, without compensation, well, government wants timber for export. And so if you live in this kind of environment, are you going to have trees on your land? No, you're going to cut down all your trees, make your land less desirable to government because your property rights simply are not secure. And you need to do what it takes to reduce the risk that government seizes your property. Changing bad institutions is not an easy task. For example, I used Guatemala and the problems with huge amounts of embezzlement by head government officials. Well, that's pretty hard to get under control, right? But if Guatemalans finally decide they're fed up, then it can happen. It might require citizens like those in Guatemala to be dissidents as needed, to stand up and fight for their rights and for what they think is deserved. And this actually happened in Slovakia. And for a number of years, I led a program in Slovakia with my friend Roman, who grew up behind the Iron Curtain. Well, if you know the history of what happened in Slovakia, and we're not going to go into it now, you'd learn that people took to the streets and refused to leave, and ultimately it led to the end of communism and, of course, central planning. Thai citizens take to the streets in protests quite regularly. This is a freedom that they seem to enjoy, and they do exercise it. In fact, I've been there while they've been protesting, and you end up with gridlock in Bangkok because they basically jam up all the major intersections intentionally. But Thais are dissidents and they do protest regularly. So when they feel that institutions are bad, they do try to do something about it. It's possible that change may require pressure from other countries. Just having people try to be dissidents and protesting might not be enough. They might need that kind of external pressure. For example, what will it take to get institutional changes in North Korea or in Burma or Myanmar? Again, it may take a lot. Let's wrap this up. So in summary, there are clear correlations between institutions and prosperity. It's hard to be prosperous when your citizens are oppressed and when competition and profit motives are absent, and it's hard to be prosperous when incentives for efficiency aren't present, when we're not using resources in the best possible way, and it's hard to be prosperous when economic freedoms don't exist, right? Economic freedoms are very important for prosperity. And it's hard to be prosperous when corruption bleeds away those resources from productive uses and channels them to non-productive uses. So guys, I hope you got a lot out of this lecture. I know it's pretty intensive. There's a lot of data, a lot of graphs, but if you have any questions, do let me know. And otherwise, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.